Thank you for listening in to the adventures of the Inner Sea's most fearsome ship, the Filthy Scoundrel. Episode 2, The Cliffs of Geb. Captain Woebegong had directed the ship to the southern coast of Geb by night. The new crewmates, along with not quartermaster after Dan instigated a vote to have Sheffy be the new quartermaster, Anchor Bill, made way to land, bringing with the amulet and a bucket to hold seawater. They had oriented the aquatic light for guidance and headed out. As they moved along, they heard something in the distance. They crept through the long grasses, finding a group at the cliff's edge. A pair of torches staked in the dirt illuminated a half-dozen rugged men armed with blades, threatening 4 men chained together. While mildly interesting, the amulet's light clearly didn't point towards them, so they were about to leave, until one of the chained men blurted out the word, treasure. That they found very interesting. After soundly putting down the pack of toughs, who fittingly referred to themselves as part of a local gang called the Grim Hounders, they set after their prize. They tossed the prisoner who had spoken off the cliff and began to question him there as he hung by his chain. Meanwhile, literally tens of feet away, Fishy Clint puffed slightly as he jogged over to a thug that had made a run for it before getting a bad case of being shot. He stopped next to him and poked him a little. The body twitched, and Clint calmly heaved up his weapon and drove a foot of the heavy pick's blade through the fallen man's skull. The sound went unnoticed by the rest of the group, all huddled around the man Fancy Dan was torturing, so Clint began to search him. The same bladed gauntlet that all these guys wore, a torch, some crappy leathers, and what's this? Clint yanked the body's jacket off and noticed movement. He grabbed the arm and rolled it over, its neck unfortunately crunching badly as the pick still anchored his head in place. On the body's back was an animated tattoo of a pack of dogs fighting each other. Delighted that he had found something worth keeping, he crouched to take his treasure. But how? He patted his pockets for something to cut with, but finding nothing, shrugged. He then took out his smaller, but still very sharp pick, and set to. Later, our party managed to continue following the direction provided by the amulet. The informant back at the cliff had been killed and dropped into the sea. The other 3 chained men returned to the Filthy Scoundrel with Anchor Bill and Scruffy. They were led through fields of wheat, then a vineyard, both tended by undead. Eventually, they found an old stone building, the amulet's light pointing towards it, but also past it, the beams separating into a set of rays. At some point, the building had been made into a grain silo. Now all that was left was a thick layer of desiccated, molding husks. He made his way deeper into complete blackness. Creeping in, he noticed shadowy figures. He held up his bucket, containing the glowing amulet, and called out. Meanwhile, outside, Fancy Dan, Illustria the Witch, and Han Su waited to see what Fishy Clint would do. None of them being able to see quite so perfectly as Clint, they waited outside. Noticing violence, however, Han Su quickly charged in, his knees pumping as he pushed through the old grain. This left Illustria and Fancy Dan, both petrified of wandering into a grain silo, aware that they had no source of light, and not lighting a match, for fear of explosion. They moved in, but only just. Fishy Clint held up the bucket, the amulet glowing faintly, only to be attacked. Perfectly silent, shadowed forms, wielding scythes, appeared out of the darkness, and advanced in utter silence. Han Su joined Clint. Illustria and Fancy Dan, unsure as how to help, did all they could. Fancy Dan, unsure of what else to do, took out his fiddle and began to play, desperately hoping to distract them. By good fortune and musical talent, he managed to strike a particular chord. This chord seemed to resonate, not just with the creatures, but with the amulet itself, it beginning to hum and glow brightly. Its glowing caused the undead themselves to fluoresce, their shuttered forms splintering into beautiful shards of light. This seemed to entice the creatures even more to Fishy Clint, but eventually our party destroyed the undead, keeping their prizes and their lives. This episode was brought to you by Forge Brand Pocket Patricks. Say, are you tired of coming up empty when a sassy senior stranger grabs your glory? Well, never again. With Forge Brand Pocket Patricks, these mouthy mini-marbles are here to help. Just remember, when you need a new conversational tactic, make it a Patrick.